Hey everybody, Brandon here, and we just got an update to Fall Guys on Nintendo Switch. This is mainly to make the game run better on Switch 2, but it is technically a Switch 1 game. So before we get into the actual update, let's take a look at how Fall Guys ran on Switch 1 originally. And as you can see by this footage here, it's not great. Loading into an actual game is pretty shaky, with the frame rate basically freezing outright as it loads the actual round. As for the gameplay itself, it hovers around 30 frames per second. It's not terribly consistent, sometimes even dipping above 30, going to like 31 or 32. But, you know, it's serviceable. Fall Guys isn't a game that I like to play at anything below 60 frames per second, so Switch 1 was never really the platform I wanted to put myself through the paces on with this game. But this is far from the experience you'd actually want with Fall Guys. But this is pre-patch Fall Guys on Switch 1. If we swap on over to Switch 1 post-update, things get a little bit more interesting. Loading up into a match still is pretty rough with a lot of stuttering and hitching, but now you'll notice that the frame rate is uncapped, with the game floating somewhere around 35, upwards of 40 frames per second. For some people, this might actually be worse. For me personally, I much prefer a stable frame rate than one that, kind of jumps around. It's fairly stable for what it is, but I would still prefer not to play this on Nintendo Switch 1. You can see that it does reach highs upwards into the 40s, so it is performing better than the original Switch 1 version, but this is still far from the experience you'd want to have. We even see it getting up to 45 FPS here, which is a significant boost over the Switch 1 original version. But the story gets its most interesting once we actually go to Nintendo Switch 2. Here I am loading into a game, and it's pretty much hitting 60 frames per second, occasionally dipping down to 57, but coming right back up. As you can see, loading into an actual match is a lot smoother on Nintendo Switch 2 than it was on Switch 1. Basically no full-on pausing like you would on Switch 1. And then we get into the actual game, and yeah, that's 60 frames per second. It does occasionally drop down to 59, but it's very infrequent and hardly noticeable. If you're playing this on Switch 2, you're going to have an infinitely better time than you would on Nintendo Switch 1. The performance is good enough that I would actually play the game and feel like I'm having a competent experience. Because it is an update to the Switch 1 version, basically uncapping the frame rate, the resolution still ends up kind of fuzzy. It's not terrible, but the game will certainly look better on PC and other consoles. But if you're looking at this as a way to play Fall Guys portably, this is an excellent way to do that. It's a bit hard to compare loading times because loading is going to vary because there's different platforms at play, even between Switch 1 and Switch 2. But it did, to my eyes, seem to be a little bit faster, but nothing groundbreaking. I'm curious to see if this will give Fall Guys some new life on Nintendo Switch. The game has, in some ways, fallen off. It's not quite in the public conscious in the way that it used to be. But if they make this well known, then perhaps the game can see a little bit of new life on Nintendo Switch 2. I didn't have any trouble finding a match, so there's certainly still a beefy player base here. And I don't have footage of this game, unfortunately, since I don't have it on Nintendo Switch. But Fall Guys isn't the only game that got a update for Nintendo Switch 2. Soma did as well. And on their post here, they note improved resolution, a more stable frame rate, faster loading time, better textures. That's essentially all the great things that you would expect going from Switch 1 to Switch 2. Thankfully, they left some screenshots here for us to look at to see what the changes are like. Visually speaking, it's not revolutionary, but it is a noticeable upgrade over the Switch 1 version of the game. The lighting is massively overhauled in this pair of screenshots here. The funny thing is, though, is I don't know which one's which. My hope is that this is just the beginning of third-party games getting Switch 2 free updates. I'd love to see Monster Hunter Rise get a 60 FPS patch on Switch 2. There are a lot of third-party games that are still 30 FPS capped on Switch 1, and they could get so much new life on Nintendo Switch 2. But that's going to do it for us for now. For all your Nintendo Switch 2 news reviews and everything in between, subscribe to GVG. We have a lot more on the way. But until then, keep the games good and the vibes greater. Bye now.